I feel like there are two very distinctly different approaches to photography, and I think that being aware of which mode you're in is an absolutely critical skill that nobody seems to be talking about. The two modes are taking and making. And if you're not at least aware of which of the two you're doing, it won't just hold your images back, it'll make photography less fun. So what are taking and making, and how can we use them both to our advantage? Which one have you been doing up until now, and how can we push our images one way or the other? I'm glad you asked. The funny thing about photography is that it's not stamp collecting. Hear me out. You ever see people's travel posts on Instagram and they've been to Japan and taken the exact same photos of these shrine gates and Mount Fuji behind the convenience store? That's always confused me a little bit. See, we have this magical power to use this tiny light-proof box to freeze time and create art out of thin air. And we're gonna use that to create a replica? To me, it feels a bit like being a poet, but then only ever copying out other people's poems. Or maybe you've mentioned that you do photography in the office and people offer up advice of pretty locations to take photos, nice parks and forests and markets and things like that. I'm sure they mean well, but aside from being an awful landscape photographer, I don't get it. If a place is already beautiful, what do you need me for? What am I adding to the conversation? To me, that's taking photos, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that approach. In fact, it's probably the better approach for beginners, since you're learning all of this technical stuff about cameras and art theory, and having a clear example of how the scene could be captured is super useful. I think above all else, the most important thing for new photographers to focus on is momentum, enjoying every photo you take, even if it's nothing special. So taking is a great option in that regard. If you're not having fun and getting excited to do more and push yourself, you'll quit pretty quickly when it gets tricky. But once you're past that initial hurdle of learning the rule of thirds and shutter speeds and all of that stuff, I think it's important to transition from taking most of the time to making most of the time. But that probably doesn't mean what you think it does. The problem with all of these rules about making stuff look good, like rule of thirds and frame within a frame and that sort of thing, is that it is a great starting point to make stuff look good, but that's the same good as everybody else. It's really easy to get sucked into those use this photography trick TikToks, but they're all missing one crucial thing. That thing isn't a stay hydrated shirt, but you should still get one. Links below. Photography isn't a science. It's an art, and art is about expressing yourself. And when you're just following the rules to make stuff look good and you're taking the cookie cutter photos that are pretty but not really yours, you're removing yourself from the equation a bit. You ever heard of this bloke? Dude's called Picasso. Apparently he's kind of a big deal with painterly types. He might just be one of the most famous and influential artists of all time or whatever. The genius of Pablo, and no, that's not a Kanye track, is that he unlearned the rules. He said as much himself. Art is not the application of a canon of beauty, but what the instinct and the brain can conceive beyond any canon. When we love a woman, we don't start measuring her limbs. Or, more simply, I think, art is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, it's not just that Picasso painted stuff wrong. I think there's one more layer to this particular art onion. I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them. And that's the real key. Picasso doesn't paint a flower, he paints how the flower makes him feel. Believe it or not, I'm not even a very big abstract painting fan. I'm more into those ones with ships in them. If you're a fan of this video so far, I'd appreciate if you subscribed. But how do we take Picasso's philosophy and then apply that to photography? Because we're taking photos of the real world. Well, it takes some time and some guts, and when you're more vulnerable and you're taking photos that are more true to you, they'll have more impact on the viewer and stand out from the crowd a lot more. So instead of taking photos start making photos by making conscious decisions about everything: the light, the colors, how you frame, what you include and don't include in the photo. And that does mean that you have to get uncomfortable. You have to try things and be completely open to your ideas sucking. You have to try things that don't make sense yet. And unfortunately, most of what you try at first will be kind of rubbish, but it will be original. Once you've broken past the psychological barrier of making and not taking, you can start to hone in on what it is that you actually like and don't like, and get better at actually creating. I'll give you a practical example. For me, in my street photography, this often looks like having a preset feeling that I want to find on the streets. Maybe I'll go looking for strangers that are sharing a funny moment, or I'll find people that are quietly reflecting. And when I find them, I'll have to figure out how to photograph them in a way that matches up with that theme. And maybe that is using rule of thirds or a slow shutter speed, or putting them in a frame within a frame, but it's not always. And most of the time, this isn't a decision based on what I feel like my portfolio or my Instagram could use, but instead by how I'm feeling at that particular time. So in a way, my street photos are portraits of me and how I was feeling at that particular moment. Now, that's all very artsy-fartsy, and while at this point I cannot escape the pretentious allegations, I think shooting intentionally has one benefit that is way bigger than just photos. It will change your worldview, because you go from seeing the world as this abstract pool of resources to be photographed like a stamp collector, to seeing this wonderful thing that you get to experience. You start to see strangers as storybooks and not subjects. So next time you grab your camera and head out for a day, try it and see how different you feel about your photos. I think you might just be surprised. For a really good example of what not to do, you should check out this video I made about photographers on TikTok. Stay hydrated and create art.